Hello, my name is John Menser, and today I would like to discuss how a person's race has been a long contributing factor to their access to equal education, and how education plays a big role in a person's socioeconomic status and their ability for upward mobility throughout the various classes. Lastly, I would like to discuss what is being done in modern times to combat unequal education that exists between the various diverse ethnic communities. So beginning with the Plesley versus Ferguson, U.S. Supreme Court declared equal but separate education, meaning African Americans and Caucasians, or whites if you will, were able to obtain equal education, but it would be separate. Now, Jim Crow laws that existed in the southern states and between the local law enforcements, countywide and stuff like that, still prevented African Americans from going to school. Now, the Brown versus the Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation in the public school systems would be discontinued, and all African American students were able to attend schools with white students. Now, this had to be enforced by state militia because you still had local law enforcement and others still trying to hold them back, but essentially they were allowed to go to school with each other. Now, the significance of Brown versus Board of Education is it was a decisive legal victory over segregation. However, what still exists today is a secondary form of segregation, and this essentially is due to social economic status, meaning children from poor African American communities do not have the same advantages as those from white or affluent communities. And that's not to say that all African Americans and all whites are in these various classes, but predominantly it's what you see in many states and cities. So according to a recent study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education, there was a pervasive disparity in resources, educational opportunities, and the treatment afforded to children of color. These lack of resources and educational opportunities leads to African Americans in these communities for being unprepared for higher education or even obtaining diplomas. According to Pedro Noguera, in larger cities, a dual system of education has emerged. A private, well-resourced system that serves a largely white, affluent student population, and an under-resourced public system that primarily serves poor children of color. With these types of barriers existing in our education system, we can see that segregation is still very prevalent in our society, but has shifted from laws that denied non-white minorities equal access to education to social economic factors that determines a non-white or African American's ability to access equal education. Now, according to the National Center of Education Statistics, the National Four-Year Adjustment Cohort Graduation Rate, also known as the ACGR, was at 79 and 80% for for non-African Americans, whereas it was at 65% for African Americans. The quality of education that exists in public schools in poor African American communities is inadequate to those in different neighborhoods, more affluent or white communities. And this leads to stratification in our education system, which essentially means by limiting the education and access to higher or better education, you're limiting a person's ability to obtain better paying jobs, which pay more money, and further provides a disparity in socioeconomic status between African Americans and Caucasians. Within the last decade or so, our government has done a few things to try to combat this. One being social improvement grants that are designed to fund significant reforms in consistently low-achieving Title I and Title II eligible schools. In fact, Congress has increased the amount of spending on school improvement grants from $125 million in 2007 to $3.5 billion in 2009. In addition, President George W. Bush in 2001 signed the No Children Left Behind Act, also known as the NCLB, which aimed to address the achievement gaps that existed between ethnic groups, mainly between African Americans and others. While there are some that support this and say that it is a great way to ensure that every ethnic community has an equal opportunity by forcing educators, principals to ensure that at least certain percent, the quotas, if you will, are being met. Let's say 80% of African Americans in this school need to meet the reading and math proficiency level. So that's how they try to enforce that. And then educators and principals are also punished, could be fired or replaced if they're not meeting those goals. So there are also some that oppose this because of the similar reasons, and also that it creates a racial atmosphere by segregating students based off of race still, because you're saying we need a certain amount of African Americans, a certain amount of whites, a certain amount of Asians, and amongst the peers, you can get a sense of this. So you're creating a racial atmosphere. And this was the case in Florida, according to Alex Band, when in October 2012, Florida required 74% of African Americans, 88% of Caucasians, 81% of Hispanics, and 90% of Asian students to be proficient in math and reading. So when looking at these numbers, you're seeing it's only 74% African Americans to meet the reading and math proficiency levels is considered successful, when looking at Asians at 90% being successful. That's a 16-point gap in between what you would consider successful for African Americans and you would consider successful for Asians, which kind of implies a negative stigma for African Americans, kind of saying that they're successful and if they're meeting that number, because they're surprised if they meet that number. It's also important to look at how universities and colleges give out loans or acceptance rates, grants, if you will, and acceptance rates based off of extracurricular activities that may be more prominent in middle class and wealthy classes, such as playing the piano, designing a software program. Now, these may not be too prevalent in African American homes or other minorities' homes. And Carolyn Shields argues little attention is paid to how giftedness is defined or assessed, or the ways in which programs are marketed to children whose families are not from the middle class dominant culture. So essentially what colleges are defining gifted is kind of in a way directed more towards middle class and higher, more wealthier classes that may be predominantly white, which also gives an unfair advantage to those from African American communities or other communities. So in order to address the inequality that exists in America in education, it is important to look at the way our educational resources are being distributed, considering poorer African American communities and more prominent Caucasian communities. It is also important to look at policies like No Children Left Behind to ensure that educators are not being forced to favor, if you will, different various ethnic backgrounds, and that puts a pressure on them that creates a racial atmosphere.